Cars today are efficient, sleek, practical, but somewhere along the way, we left behind the quirks, the features that gave cars their soul as technology evolved and safety standards tightened. These features started to disappear. Some faded quietly, others were ripped away by new rules or shifting trends. And now, they're just relics. Footnotes in automotive history. In this video, we're not just listing them, we're remembering them. So buckle up, and maybe leave a little room for nostalgia. This is a ride through the features we lost and the stories they left behind. Pop-up headlights. What a moment they were. These little mechanical wizards could transform an ordinary car into something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Flip a switch and bam, they'd rise up like the car was coming alive. But here's the thing. Their roots stretch all the way back to the 1930s. That's right. Cars like the Cord 810 pioneered the concept, and by the 1970s and 80s, they were everywhere, from sleek Ferraris to humble Honda Preludes. The idea wasn't just about looking cool, though let's be honest, they did. They solved a problem. Designers wanted low, aerodynamic front ends, but regulations demanded headlights be mounted at a certain height. The solution? Hide them when you didn't need them. Simple, brilliant. Of course, moving parts meant trouble. Jams, misalignments, or one headlight stuck halfway up, giving your car a weird, lazy eye vibe. Add new safety laws, and by 2004, they were gone. Vent windows. Now there's a blast from the past. Small, triangular pieces of glass you could push out with a flick of the wrist. Simple, right? But back in the day, they were a lifeline. Air conditioning was a luxury, rare, expensive, and definitely not standard. So vent windows were your built-in, no-frills air circulation system. They first appeared in the 1930s and stuck around for decades. By the 50s and 60s, they were everywhere, from pickup trucks to Cadillacs. There was something satisfying about cracking open that little window, feeling a rush of air that didn't involve a fan or a compressor. But then AC got cheaper, more efficient, and vent windows, they became obsolete. By the late 90s, they had all but disappeared, clinging to a few trucks as their final stronghold. Today, they're just a memory, a reminder of a time when even a little breeze felt like innovation. Power antennas. Remember those? For years, they were the epitome of fancy. You'd turn on the radio, and the antenna would rise majestically from the body of the car, like it was preparing for liftoff. It wasn't just cool, it solved a real problem. Fixed antennas were constantly getting bent, snapped, or even stolen. This was the future. They first appeared in the 1950s and stuck around for decades, especially on luxury cars. But there was a downside. As elegant as they looked, power antennas were delicate. One little malfunction, dust in the gears, a misaligned motor, and suddenly your antenna was stuck. Fully extended. In a storm. You get the idea. By the early 2000s, automakers figured out how to tuck antennas into the car's design, making power antennas, well, unnecessary. Cool? Absolutely. Practical? Not so much. Still, they'll always have a special place in the hearts of anyone who grew up with them. Landau roofs. Now those were something. They were these vinyl-covered sections of the car roof meant to mimic the look of a convertible. Fancy, right? At least, that was the idea. In the 1960s and 70s, if your car had a Landau roof, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement. You'd arrived. The name itself traces back to horse-drawn carriages from Landau, Germany. That connection gave the design a certain elegance, or at least it tried to. But here's the thing, vinyl doesn't age gracefully. These roofs would crack, peel, and just fall apart over time, leaving owners with expensive repairs or a car that looked like it had a bad sunburn. By the 1990s, they were fading fast, out of style and off production lines. Today, you might spot one on a classic Cadillac or a lovingly restored Oldsmobile, a throwback to an era when even the roof tried to look fancy. CB radios. Now that was a whole vibe. Picture this, it's the 1970s, and cell phones? Not even a dream yet. But you've got a little black box in your car that lets you talk to anyone within a few miles. Truckers, other drivers, maybe even your buddy in the car behind you. It was communication on the go, before anyone even thought of texting. The Citizens Band Radio, or CB for short, hit its stride in the 70s, thanks to relaxed FCC rules and, of course, pop culture. Movies like Smokey and the Bandit turned CB radios into a trend. They weren't just tools, they were cool. You'd come up with a handle, learn the lingo, and suddenly you were part of this secret rolling network. But trends fade. By the 80s, cell phones were creeping in, and CBs started to fade out. Still, for a while, they made driving feel like an adventure. T-tops, those removable roof panels that made every car feel like it was ready for a summer joyride. They weren't just a feature, they were a mood. General Motors rolled out the first T-tops in the 1968 Chevrolet Corvette, and soon they were popping up on everything from Pontiac Firebirds to Camaros. It was freedom, right above your head. The design was ingenious. You got the open-air experience of a convertible without losing the structural integrity of a hardtop, or at least that was the theory. In reality, T-tops leaked, constantly. Rain, car washes, even morning dew found a way inside. And let's not forget the safety concerns. Cutting two giant holes in a roof didn't exactly scream structural stability. By the early 2000s, automakers gave up on T-tops. The last hurrah? The 2002 Pontiac Firebird. They're rare now, but for a while, they made every drive feel like a scene from an action movie. Front bench seats. Now that was a different era, wasn't it? A time when cars were more like living rooms on wheels. Stretch out, slide over, or cram in a few extra friends. It was all possible with that long, uninterrupted seat. They weren't just practical, they felt communal. This design came straight out of the horse-drawn carriage days and carried into early 20th century automobiles. By the 1950s and 60s, the bench seat was a staple in big American sedans. Families loved them. Couples, even more so. Nothing said date night like sitting shoulder to shoulder on a front bench. But then came the 1970s. Safety regulations demanded seatbelts and headrests. Bucket seats, with their individual comfort and built-in seatbelts, started to dominate. Slowly but surely, the front bench became a rarity, lingering mostly in trucks. Today, it's a relic, a reminder of when cars were made for togetherness, not just transportation. Velour seats. Ah yes, the fabric of the gods, or at least that's what carmakers wanted us to think. In the 1970s and 80s, velour was everywhere, from compact sedans to luxury Cadillacs. It was soft, plush, and undeniably flashy. For a while, it felt like you were sitting on a cloud. A warm, slightly sticky cloud. Velour wasn't just about comfort, it was about making cars feel fancier. Leather was expensive, and vinyl? Well, vinyl could get uncomfortably hot in the summer. Velour, with its textured patterns and rich colors, seemed like the perfect middle ground, until it wasn't. Long road trips exposed its biggest flaw: sweat. Velour trapped heat like nobody's business, and over time, it would flatten and wear out, leaving seats looking tired and sad. By the 1990s, velour had largely disappeared, replaced by materials that didn't overheat your backside. Still, for a while, it felt like luxury, sort of. Button-tufted seats. Now that was a look. Back in the 70s and 80s, these cushy, overstuffed seats made cars feel more like lounge furniture than transportation. You'd sink in, surrounded by rows of little buttons, like you were riding in your grandpa's favorite armchair. The idea wasn't new. Tufting had been a sign of luxury for decades. Car makers latched onto it, thinking, why not make every ride feel like a sofa on wheels? And for a while, it worked. But those buttons, they'd pop off. The padding would sag, and eventually it all felt dated, like a leftover from a Vegas hotel lobby. By the 1990s, tufting had all but vanished, replaced by sleeker, more modern designs. Still, for a while, it added a quirky, cozy charm to the road. Wood paneling on cars. Yeah, fake wood. In the 60s and 70s, it wasn't just a design choice, it was a trend. You'd see it slapped on everything from station wagons to minivans. Why? Because nothing says family road trip like simulated oak glued to your doors. The idea actually started with real wood, way back in the 1930s on luxury cars. But by the time the 70s rolled around, car makers swapped the real thing for vinyl. It looked the part. Until it didn't. Peeling, cracking, fading. It didn't age well. By the mid-90s, wood paneling disappeared, a quirky remnant of suburban nostalgia. Manual transmissions. a rite of passage for generations of drivers. Learning to coordinate the clutch, the gas, and the gear stick, it was like mastering a secret handshake with your car. Back in the early 20th century, all cars were manual. Automatics didn't even show up until the 1940s. By the 1970s and 80s, stick shifts were still everywhere. Trucks, sedans, sports cars. They gave you control, a connection to the road. But then convenience took over. Automatics got better, easier, and, well, manual transmissions started disappearing. Today, they're rare, mostly in sports cars or classics, clinging to the thrill of yesterday. Cigarette lighters in cars. Once a standard feature, they weren't just for smokers, they were symbols of an era. First introduced in the 1920s, these little push-button heaters were marvels of simplicity. You'd press it in, wait for the pop, and voila, instant heat. By the 1950s and 60s, nearly every car had one, along with ashtrays tucked into dashboards, doors, and even back seats. But as smoking declined and charging electronics rose, lighters found a new purpose. They became power outlets for GPS devices, phones, and more. Eventually, the lighter itself vanished, replaced by USB ports. A quiet end to a fiery legacy. Rich Corinthian leather. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you probably heard those words, delivered with dramatic flair by Ricardo Montalban in Chrysler ads. It sounded luxurious, exotic even. But here's the truth. There was nothing Corinthian about it. It was just standard leather, dressed up with clever marketing.
Everyone asks, Corinthian leather? Of course, why not the best? It's the same with our new Chrysler New Yorker. It gives you everything. Powerful.
The phrase didn't come from a factory in Corinth or some ancient craft. Nope, it was invented to make Chrysler's interiors feel fancier. And for a while it worked. People believed they were getting something truly special. Today, it's more of a joke than a legacy, a catchy line that outlived the product itself. 3 on the tree. If you know, you know. This quirky gear-shifting setup, mounted on the steering column, was everywhere from the 1940s to the 70s. It was the standard manual transmission before floor shifters became the norm. Simple, functional, but kind of awkward. Learning it was a rite of passage. You'd struggle to find the gears at first, maybe grind a few. But once you got it, it felt like magic, like you'd cracked some secret code. By the 1980s, it started disappearing. Automatics took over, and floor-mounted 4-speeds stole the show. Today, it's a charming relic of simpler, clunkier times. Manual windows. You remember, those little cranks you had to twist a dozen times just to get the window down. It was a workout, especially in the back seat, where kids seemed to be stuck doing it forever. This was the standard for decades, simple, sturdy, and, well, slow. Crank windows trace back to the early days of cars. Automakers prioritized function over luxury, and these things rarely broke. But by the 1980s and 90s, power windows became the new norm. No more cranking, no more elbow grease, just a button. Today, manual windows are almost extinct, a memory of when effort was part of the ride. Floor-mounted high-beam switches. If you've never used one, you're missing out on a strange little piece of automotive history. These small metal buttons, tucked under your left foot, controlled your high beams with a satisfying click. Simple, convenient, and oddly satisfying. Introduced in the 1920s, they stuck around for decades, becoming second nature for drivers by the 1950s. But there was a problem. Dirt, mud, sometimes even snow could jam the switch. Or worse, you'd accidentally turn it on while adjusting your foot. By the 1980s, they were replaced by steering column controls. Easier, sure, but not nearly as charming. Rear-facing seats in station wagons, now those were the ultimate in road trip nostalgia. Sitting in the way back, you weren't just riding in the car, you were commanding a rolling observation deck. You could wave at drivers, make faces at strangers, or just watch the world shrink behind you. These seats popped up in the 1950s and became a staple of family wagons by the 70s. They folded away neatly for extra cargo space, but when in use, pure fun. By the 1990s, stricter safety standards and SUVs spelled their end. But for those who remember, they were magic. 2-key ignition systems. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when buying a car meant getting two keys, one for the doors and another for the ignition. It sounds inefficient, right? But back in the day, it was standard. This setup gained traction in the mid-20th century, with automakers like General Motors leading the charge. The logic, separating functions made the car more secure. But really, it just made losing one key that much worse. By the 1980s, the single-key system started taking over, thanks to improved technology. Two keys faded into history, a small, jangly inconvenience we don't miss. Wide whitewall tires, now those were a statement. Popular in the 1930s and 40s, these bold, gleaming stripes weren't just tires, they were fashion. They turned ordinary wheels into rolling works of art. The trend exploded post-War II as cars got bigger, shinier, and flashier. White walls became a symbol of elegance, the perfect complement to a Cadillac or Buick. But maintaining them? Oh, that was a chore. Dirt, grime, white walls demanded constant attention. By the 1960s, tastes shifted to narrower stripes, and eventually, black wall tires took over. Today, white walls are rare, but they remain iconic, a nod to when cars had style baked into every detail. Fuel caps behind the license plate, now that was a quirky little design choice. Back in the 1950s and 60s, some cars had their gas tank hidden behind the rear license plate. You'd flip it down, almost like uncovering a secret compartment. Clever? Sure. Convenient? Not exactly. The idea was to keep the car's lines clean, uninterrupted by a gas cap on the body. It worked, aesthetically, but practically, not so much. Imagine fumbling with the license plate in the rain, or worse, on a muddy roadside. By the 1980s, this design was gone, practicality won, but for a while, it was a little slice of automotive mystery. Hood ornaments. Once upon a time, they were the crowning jewel of a car's design, tiny sculptures that sat proudly on the hood, catching the light as you drove. Rolls-Royce had its spirit of ecstasy, Cadillac its soaring wings. They weren't just decorative, they were statements. Luxury, prestige. The tradition began in the early 1900s, evolving from radiator caps to full-blown art pieces. But as safety standards tightened, those ornaments became a problem. Pedestrians and sharp metal don't mix well. By the 1980s, most had vanished, replaced by flat emblems. The magic? Gone, but they remain iconic, symbols of a grander era. Automatic seatbelts. Now there's a blast from the past. These things were, well, ambitious. First introduced in the late 1970s and popularized in the 80s, they were meant to solve a growing problem. People just weren't wearing seatbelts. Automakers thought, hey, what if the car could handle that for you? And thus, the sliding shoulder belt was born. Here's how it worked. You'd open the door, sit down, and whoosh, the belt would glide across your chest, as if saying, don't worry, I've got this. But there was a catch. The lap belt? You still had to buckle that yourself. And, most people didn't. Oh, and those motors? They'd burn out. Or worse, jam at the worst possible moment, leaving you half strapped in and completely frustrated. By the early 90s, automakers had had enough. They abandoned the idea altogether, leaving automatic seatbelts as one of the more awkward automotive experiments. And there you have it, a journey through the quirks, the charm, and the ingenuity of the past. These features weren't just designs, they were stories. Each one, a snapshot of a time when cars had personalities and sometimes a few peculiarities. If you enjoyed this drive down memory lane, why not take another trip with us? Subscribe to Vintageverse, where nostalgia takes the wheel. From forgotten treasures to iconic designs, we explore it all. Don't just watch, delve into the universe of everything vintage. Hit subscribe and let's keep the memories alive, one story at a time.